sending in tanks, heavy artillery and other equipment to 6 NATO allies in the Baltics and Eastern Europe in response to Russia's actions in Ukraine. Russia has denounced the actions by NATO as Cold War-style provocations while upgrading its own armed forces. Russian President Vladimir Putin is pledging to deploy more than 40 nuclear ballistic missiles this year. Joining us now is Vladimir Goldstein. He is an associate professor of Slavic studies at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. And here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio is Peter Kuznick. He is a professor of history at American University and the co-author of The Untold History of the United States. Thanks both for joining us. Vladimir, first of all, to you, the question has to be asked, as we see this reinforcement by NATO, Russia is still saying that the West has got everything wrong when it comes to Russian foreign policy in Ukraine. Does Vladimir Putin have a point?
I think he has an absolute point, and it was obvious, since the very beginning of the crisis. Somehow, the way Western presents this crisis is that some kind of a Russian aggression, Russia is in charge, Russia is doing this, Russia is doing that. But, the facts of the matter are very clear. Russia acts reactively. There were, the violent overthrow of the government in Ukraine on the Russian border. Okay, fine. Then this new government, which was installed sort of illegally, not waiting for the votes, whatever, start banning Russian language, start doing sort of other crazy things. Russians respond in their particular way. Then the whole thing escalates. So he more or less responds, reacts. It's been known on paper since 2008 or whatever that Russia wouldn't tolerate NATO forces on Georgian border, on Ukrainian border. There is a document recently published by former Ambassador Burns in 2008 where he said Ukraine is a very complex society, very torn apart society. If we move there too aggressively, country will split apart. We don't know how Russia will respond to that. So the United States knew this, it's a tinderbox. Yet they somehow went for that. They start sort of, tinkering with it. And Putin responds because he has to defend his country's interest.
It's interesting, Peter. Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State, also has said that Ukraine is a much more complex society than the West has been painting it out, and we were bound to get into this sort of problem. Vladimir Putin has said, look, the sanctions that have come and now just been renewed by the EU have not divided Russian society. They are not working, and they're just being punished because they're pursuing an independent foreign policy. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's true. It has been hurting Russia. But that's not the major reason why the Russian economy has been suffering. It was the drastic cut in oil and gas prices that really had the impact. The sanctions have made things a little bit worse, but what it's done is it's rallied the Russian people around Putin. The support for Putin is well over 80%. So this has not made Putin less popular. In fact, it's made it more popular, and it's reinforced a kind of narrative inside Russia that looks back at the entire 20th century and now the 21st century and sees it in very, very different terms than the Western narrative. So not only we have, as Vladimir was saying, two fundamentally different narratives about what's happening recently in Ukraine, we have two fundamentally different narratives about what's happening in the past 120 years in terms of U.S.-Russian relations.
Yeah, Vladimir, I want to bring you back in because Peter said the sanctions are hurting, but support is strong for President Putin at home in spite of the isolation, if you like, of Russia in Eastern and Western Europe. Can Russia continue to do what it's doing on its own?
Well, first of all, the rumors of this isolation is, exaggerated. There is, of course, some kind of a media blockade because Western media prefers, as we talked about, one narrative blaming Russia. Russia is like non-civilized, Russia this and that. But basically, even Western companies are pretty active in Russia. There is, tremendous amount of interest already been accumulated during this period. So the Germany is trading, French is trading, the rest of the world is trading. So I wouldn't say that this is just, Russia will ever get to some kind of a serious blockade. Of course, certain companies are limited, certain individuals are limited, but I don't think it's particularly serious. But there is some other things should be stressed. Let's back off a little bit. after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, Russia, they were not perfect. They were grappling with their issues. They were trying to solve, political, economic, problems like that. Both countries were kind of divided. Now Ukraine continues to be divided. It's really sort of, there is a civil war goes on there between East and, Kiev regime, which continues to bombard it. Russia, on the other hand, is get united. So these actions actually produce the absolutely adverse effect. Russia is now 89%, according to recent polls, are behind Putin. So I don't see that effectiveness. My feeling is that people who started it didn't really think through. Russians are pretty known for their skills in chess. They're supposed to think through certain steps, but Washington just went there as a bull in the China shop, and the chips are continuing to fall.
Peter, pick up on that, but also, Ukraine isn't a member of NATO, but it is drifting towards the European Union. There is this slight disconnect, as Vladimir was saying, about how Germany feels about the situation and, say, Washington. But Washington isn't prepared to intervene militarily in Ukraine.
Nor is Germany, nor is anybody else, really. But to back up to what Vladimir was saying, in many ways, the sanctions and the U.S. attempt to economically isolate Russia is backfiring, because it's forced Russia to disengage to some extent with Europe and to look for other allies and partners. There's a meeting beginning tomorrow in Ufa in Russia of the BRICS. So which countries are these? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Other countries are also joining in. They've got their own development plans. China has recently started its own Asia Infrastructure Development Bank. We've got similar kinds of economic arrangements going on. So, and if you have to look toward the future, who are you going to want to ally with? The emerging countries, China and India and Brazil and South Africa, or what Rumsfeld famously called old Europe, in a very dismissive way at one point.
You mean Donald Rumsfeld, the former U.S. Secretary of Defense, of course, who led the invasion into Iraq. So you say Russia is pivoting east towards Asia. But what's the end game here for Europe and the United States, Vladimir? Because the sanctions have just been renewed. There is still a real tension within the country. It seems to be at a stalemate. What's the way forward here for Russia and the West? Can there be some sort of accommodation down the road?
Well, let me start with a little kind of maybe example or analogy, which should be clear, at least for the audience in the United States, many other places. If you have a house and you want to remodel it drastically, in the middle of the house you want to do a swimming pool or something, the first thing you do is consult all your neighbors. You have to make sure that it's sort of fine by them. And, and Ukraine has a very powerful neighbor, to the east, Russia, which have tremendous, economic ties, social ties, ethnic ties. There's brothers and sisters live, across the border. So when they, I am all supporting for Ukraine joining, democracy and being prosperous. But you become prosperous, but sort of doing things right. So Russia was very clear, we don't want you to join NATO. But Ukraine thought, we now have this big support from, say, chief of the police of the town, and chief of the police of the town will help us rebuild anything we want on our property. So the chief of police being US, and eventually neighbors are all up in arms. So basically, Ukraine has to sit down and look at this realistically, and so should Europe, and so should Russia, and so should US, and they have to solve this problem.
Peter, I like the analogy of Ukraine building a swimming pool without its neighbor's position. But where do we go from here?
Not only without its neighbors' cooperation, the problem is Ukrainians don't know how to swim. So it's even more irrational than that. If you look at Ukraine's economy, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, it has been an absolute basket case.
And in fact is going cap in hand to the IMF at the same time.
Yeah, you look what's happening in Greece now. You want an example of what the Ukrainians have to look forward to. It's going to be massive austerity. We've already seen each of the last 2 quarters has been a 15% cut in production in GDP in Ukraine. We have massive austerity being imposed. The West doesn't really want to bail Ukraine out. And Ukraine desperately needs economic relations with Europe as well as with Russia. But their ties are historically much more closely aligned with Russia.
Okay, so we know what the problems are, but how do we get to a solution? The Minsk agreement signed back in February was meant to de-escalate, pull forces back, a decentralize authority, not federate, as the ambassador was saying. So why haven't we got anywhere near to where this Minsk agreement wanted it to be?
There's been tremendous resistance on the part of Poroshenko and the government in Kiev. And they have relied increasingly on these militias, which are often right-wing militias, some of them with a lot of neo-fascist elements. And they have been trying to say, we want to take back that territory militarily as part of it. They don't want to talk to the opposition forces, and they don't want to carry out the federalization. The agreement calls for giving a lot of autonomy to those Western states, the Donbass region, and they are very hesitant to do that.
What about Vladimir, the Russian people? What do they think should happen in Ukraine going forward?
Well, Russian people, as I suggested, it's so much, they're so much intermixed with Ukrainians. You can have people, whose, fathers-in-law, brothers-in-law, sisters living in the eastern Ukraine, western Ukraine, and then keep on hearing the reports that, eastern Ukraine continues to be bombarded, continues to be bullied into submission. Somehow the leaders in Kyiv do not want this, giving them some kind of autonomy, because either they feel they're probably under double pressure. On the one hand, I think U.S. doesn't want the autonomy to the east, because that means east is influencing Ukrainian politics, but also they're under pressure, as Peter said, from this nationalists who would view it as a weakness. So Kyiv does want to acknowledge the autonomy and continue sort of to bomb them into submission. There are already more than 6,000 people killed, about 1 million people refugees, running primarily to Russia. So Russia hears this, they get upset. Russian people get upset, for how long this bombardment will go on. So there is a pressure actually on Putin, endless pressure to act.
Okay, Peter, a final thought from you. What about Russian reaction to the increased NATO forces in 6 eastern and Baltic states?
It's dangerous. What you've got is a game of chicken going on both sides, but we're talking about nuclear-armed chicken. And so as one side escalates, clearly military escalation on the part of NATO, but the Russians are responding in kind. And we have to always remember that the US and Russia have hundreds of missiles with thousands of nuclear warheads pointed at each other on hair-trigger alert. This is what, 24 years after the end of the Cold War? And the situation is still very, very dangerous. There is a Cold War mentality in many parts, a zero-sum game. The original agreement was a zero-sum game, and it still continues, and it's a very dangerous situation.
Peter Kuznick.